Hi, welcome to our 10th and our final discussion board. It's hard to believe that we've already done 10 of these this 2 weeks. Um, what I'm looking for out of today's discussion board is an opportunity to you to reflect on what you've learned in the 9 prior discussion boards. I started off in the first board reminding you that the definition of effective teaching is creating an environment where students can learn, and doing that where students learn not just in their head, the cognitive, but also in their hearts, the affective domain, and also in their hands, the psychomotor domain. So the idea has been that I'm trying to create this environment where you can get an idea of what's it like to try to set up a schedule? What's it like to try to be learning online? What's it like to interact with each other and process my feelings? What's it like to have some kind of routine? What exactly is going on with this COVID virus, and how are things progressing, and how are we dealing with it? So there's been a lot that we've gone through and worked with, and I'm sure you've learned some things, both about others as well as about yourself, as well as about me, as well as some facts, some things you've looked at, some ways you've been able to kind of look at the news and interpret it maybe a little bit differently. And so I want to quickly run through what we've done in the 9 different discussion boards, and I would like you to go back and do a couple of things. Number one, I'd like you to read all of your answers to all 9 discussion boards. Yeah, I know that that's a little bit of work, but that's how reflective exercises go, right? You spend some time looking at what you wrote, what your thoughts were, and then you come forward and write your final discussion board post. So the final discussion board post should look back at the 9 prior discussion boards and reflect on some things. And here's what I'm looking for you to kind of report in your 10th discussion board. What was the most significant or most surprising? If you don't have anything significant, what was the most surprising? If you have both significant and surprising, share both. What was the most significant or surprising thing you learned in your head, in your heart, and in your hands? So what was the most significant or most surprising thing that you learned about in your heart, in your hands, in your head? So this should have at least kind of like 3 bullet points. The most significant or most surprising thing I learned in my head was. The most significant, most surprising thing I learned in my heart, my feelings was. The most significant, most surprising things I learned in my hands, in what I'm doing was. Right? So what did you learn significant or surprising about yourself, about others, about what's going on? What did you learn in your head, in your heart, and in your hands? So your post should have kind of these 3 bullet points in there to reflect on them. And then I'd like to see this kind of 4th bullet point. And that's for you to kind of give me some feedback on the question, was this an effective way to learn during a crisis? We've had a big disruption of what's going on. Was switching to a discussion board, having a regular schedule, having a set of questions that pushed you in your head, your heart, and your hands, was this an effective way for you to learn about what's going on with the virus, about how do you develop the life skills to be able to deal with culture shock, and how do you process the emotions of what it'll be like when somebody that is close to you passes away from this, right? So I would like you to spend some time going back and first reading all 9 prior discussion boards, and then answering the question, what's the most significant or surprising thing you learned in your head, your heart, and your hands, and was this an effective way to learn? Now, let's quickly review these 9 discussion boards. Remember, discussion boards 1, 2, and 3 got into head, hearts, and hands, right? Question 1 is, how do we flatten the curve? Question 2 is, how did this situation make you feel? And question 3, what were your life hacks to start to feel normal? So you answered those kind of straightforward. Boom, boom, boom. Day 1, day 2, day 3. Day 4, I pivoted into a little bit of a different space. I called it laughing through the tears. We all shared the memes, we shared the stories, we shared the interesting things that we were using to help us get over kind of the fact that everything was disrupted and unusual. And then I ask a practical question on day 5. What's it going to take for us to open everything back up? How do we communicate that to the public? What's the data we need, right? because this is a complicated thing. And so after 5 days of kind of being in discussion and seeing what was going on, we could ask and answer the question, what's it going to look like to open things back up? That's kind of moving from kind of your base level responses to something that's a little bit higher order, kind of some synthesis, some thinking about it. Now, day 6, I pivoted and asked you, what are your questions? So it was an opportunity for you to start to reflect and think about, what do you know? What don't you know? What's important enough that you write down, I'd like to know more about? So that was really a level of evaluation, particularly self-evaluation. What do I know and not know, and what do I want to know more about? So the when do we open up was analysis. What questions do you have was essentially instead of an evaluation, was an analysis, right? So you said, so when do we, was it an evaluation of self-knowledge? So when do we open up? Analysis of when we open. Evaluation, what do you know or what don't you know? Those are higher level kind of learning activities. Then I've moved us in 7, 8, and 9 to things that were difficult questions that get into our mind, that get into our heart, and get into our hands. And they were kind of a higher level of head, heart, and hands. The head question, right, is what's the end game? What do we call victory? What are we looking forward to? What's the short term, mid-term, and long term, right? How do we see things over the horizon? That is kind of an advanced head question. It's not just how do we flatten the curve. It's actually how do we get our minds around the fact that there will be another side to the curve. The next one, number 8, got a lot of variety of responses, and this was a really difficult heart question, right? My first hard question was, how does this make you feel? On discussion board 8, I ask you a much more difficult heart question is, how are you going to feel when a loved one dies from COVID-19? That's a lot more personal, and that's going to elicit a lot more emotion. That's going to cause us to have all kinds of responses in terms of how do we process grief. And so that was a tough question because most of us, being engineers, we generally don't start with things like, how do you feel? We start with things like, what do you think? Now, question 9 was squarely in the space of what are you going to do? Remember, the third discussion board is what are your life hacks to feel normal? Question 9, again, in the hand space, what is culture shock and how are you experiencing it now? I wanted to leave you with actually kind of the example in the hands of what we're all dealing with. Many of you Googled culture shock. That's awesome. That's exactly what I was looking for you to do. You saw that there was these kind of curves that went with culture shock, right? This kind of thing that bounced up and down. And you probably noticed that the bouncing up and down, the highs and the lows, the amplitude got less until you got to acceptance and adaptation. So your feelings are going to go up and down. You're like, hey, I'm so annoyed to be home. Hey, I'm so scared. Hey, it's so exciting to do this online learning. It's going to go up and down, but that amplitude is going to kind of flatten out until you adjust. You come to accept the new norm. So discussion board 10, the one you're responsible for today, pretty straightforward thing. Go back and read your prior 9 discussion boards. Think about your head, your heart, and your hands. Give me an answer that's looking at 4 things. What's the most significant thing you learned or surprising thing you learned in your head, in your heart, in your hands? Kind of 3 bullet points. And bullet point number 4, was this discussion board, was this process an effective way for you to learn during this COVID-19 crisis as we did a transition to online learning? I am so proud of your responses. I am so grateful for how gracious you've been with each other and particularly with me as we've worked through this. Believe it or not, in the professor instruction book of how to teach classes and how to work with students, the page for how to deal with online transition and COVID-19, it was blank. There was nothing there. So I say that again as kind of laughing through the tears. This is as much an experiment for me as it has been for you. We're working through this together. I hope you've enjoyed the opportunity to have a little bit of new normal, seeing a quick YouTube video, hearing a voice, seeing a face, realizing that we're still connected. We're still all working on this together. We're still all in this together, but realizing there's a new normal, a new way of doing this. So 10th discussion board. reflect on your prior 9 posts. Tell me what was the most significant or surprising thing you learned in your head, your heart, and your hands, and then address the question of, is this an effective way to learn during a crisis? Be safe, have fun, keep at it. We'll be working on this together, and I'm still just an email or a phone call or a Zoom message away. I'm wishing you all the best, and I will see you on the other side.